We're about to install the pistons, but we need to make a few preparations to the block first. We started with the driver's side pistons. Wipe your cylinders clean with a dry paper towel. Remember, don't use a shop rag. Then squirt some clean engine oil on another clean paper towel and wipe a nice, thin, even film all over the cylinders. Earlier, we filed our rings for a custom fit, and now it's time for them to go on the pistons. Your rings should be in order and ready to go. You could hold the rod and piston assembly in a vise, or you could just lay the piston in your lap. There should be some kind of label that'll tell you what each ring in the package is.
The first one to go on is the oil expander ring. It slips right into the bottom groove. You want to make sure that the ends of the expander ring don't overlap. Now get out one of the oil scraper rails. We'll deal with the top one first. Slide it between the roof of the groove in the piston and the top of the expander ring. When the edge of the ring is in, you'll want to slowly work it clockwise around the piston. As you go around, it should slip right into place, but when you get to the other side of the piston, slow down. The edge of the ring could scratch the side of the piston, so pinch it tight and pull it away from the piston just a little, and it should drop in place in the top of the expander ring. The other scraper rail will start about 45 degrees to the other side of the expander gap, and it's going to slip into the bottom slot. Work it around the other way, counterclockwise, and guide it past the top scraper and into the bottom groove as you go. Pull it away slightly at the end, it should clear and slip right into its groove.
Double check that your expander gap is not overlapped. If it is, use 2 paper clips or picks to pull them apart until they click into alignment with the rails. It's important to rotate the rings now and make sure that nothing is stuck or crooked.
Now for the second groove. Take a look at the ring. There's usually a label on one side of the ring, like a dot or a T, or sometimes there's some bevel machined into the ring itself. When you know which way the ring goes, grab the ring expander with one hand and steady the ring itself with the other. Only expand it just enough to get the ring to slip down past the first groove and into its place in the second. It should rotate freely. The package should have a label for the top rings too. A lot of top rings have a shiny look on the edges when you compare them to the second groove rings. Use the same technique, expand just enough with the top mark facing up, and the rings are in. Repeat for the rest of the pistons in your tray. If you have custom filed rings and you have different gaps for each one depending on which bore it goes into, be careful, you don't want to mix them up. Now that the rings are in place, we still have a few more steps before the pistons can go in. Grab the appropriate half of the bearing from your storage bin, wipe any residual oil off of the rod and the back of the bearing, and install the bearing shell.
We strongly recommend you use Cleveite high-pressure assembly lubricant to protect the bearings during the few critical moments after startup until oil pressure stabilizes. After a liberal coating, the rod bolt protectors need to slip on. Pay close attention and be sure that the protector boots seat all the way to the rod body. Also double check that the bearing shell is fully seated in the rod. The last preparation is to set the positions of the ring gaps in the piston. Start by putting a few drops of engine oil along each groove. Next, grasp all the rings together and spin them around to spread a light coating throughout the rings and grooves. With a clean paper towel, wipe any large drips and spread a light coating evenly over both skirts of the piston as well. Now let's set the ring gaps.
For most engines, this setup will work well. For the pistons on the driver's side of the block, the top compression ring gap should be here. The second ring gap would locate opposite the top ring at this position. Down in the oil groove, the point where the wavy expander ring butts together should line up with the gap in the top ring. Then slide the oil scraper rings so that one is in this position and the other is in this position. Each of them should be about 45 degrees to the left or the right of the second ring gap. With the rings installed on the piston, if you tried to fit the piston into its bore, the rings are going to stop it from sliding in. To do the install, we need to put the piston in a ring compressor. There's a lot of different ones available. One type that we don't recommend is the ribbon style compressor. These ring compressors are notorious for breaking rings and they're not very easy to use. If this is all you have, you just need to be really careful with it and tighten slowly.
This and any other type of compressor can start to get crooked while you're tightening. With any compressor, there's a chance that it will pinch a ring in its groove and break it. This would mean you would have to buy a whole new set of rings just to replace the broken one. This fact alone makes it worthwhile to buy a quality ring compressor such as this universal style. With any type of compressor, you should fit the piston in and snug up the compressor until it's barely grabbing the rings. Square up the compressor and look down inside.
As you slowly tighten the compressor, make sure the ring gap positions stay where you want them, and rock the compressor slightly left and right to make sure that the rings aren't caught on the edges of their grooves. When the compressor is about to pinch tight against the edge of the piston, you're going to want to slip it in its bore. But first check and make sure that the crank's rod journal is straight down in the bottom dead center position, and also make sure that the forward mark on the piston is facing the front of the engine. Once the piston's in its bore, it'll be square with the block. Tap on the edges of it so that the compressor will sit square to the block as well on all sides. Now tighten the compressor until it pinches tight on the piston. If your ring compressor is one of those styles that's tightened by a hose clamp, then back out the screw a half turn just to release some of the squeeze that's on the piston. We're almost at the moment of truth, but wait, don't smack on the piston yet.
Rotate the compressor and make sure that it's sitting square on the deck and that it's perpendicular to the block itself. Have a look up into the cylinder from below. You want to slide the connecting rod over so that it'll have some clearance to make it by the crank throw as you hammer in the piston.
Now you can have at it. Use the rubber handle of a hammer, or better yet, give the pistons some solid hits with one of these special piston hammers. You want to smack it hard enough to make it slide past the grip of the ring compressor, but if you feel even the slightest resistance, stop and check the compressor. If you see any of the oil scraper rings popping out, or even one of the compression rings, pull the compressor off and check everything. If you're tapping really slowly, a little at a time, and a ring keeps popping out, when you reset it, try hitting a little harder in the beginning so that the piston will move quickly past the entrance of the block deck. Once you're in, the compressor can get put aside, and you just need to tap lightly to get the piston to go all the way down to the crank. The protector boots will guide the rod into place on the crank, and the rod will seat nicely on the rod journal as long as your bearing is still in place. Grab the cap that goes with the rod, lube it up, and look at the marks that you stamped on the sides of the rod and the cap to fit the cap on the right way. When the cap is in place, thread on the nuts and cinch them hand tight with a ratchet.
In pre-assembly, we checked to make sure the cam didn't interfere with the rotation of the pistons and rods. Now we need to make a few more rotations of the crank to be sure that the rings aren't scarring up the walls of the cylinder. If a ring broke while you were putting in the pistons, you'd notice some scratching on the walls. Look all around the cylinders as you rotate and see if you notice any scratches that weren't there before. If you see a scratch, run your fingernail against it. If you're concerned that the scratch might be from a broken ring, pull out the piston and check the rings. If everything checks out okay, reinstall and let's move on to the next piston.
Rotate the next rod journal to its bottom position, and when the compressor is tight, tap on the compressor again to make sure that it's square with the block just like before. With the pistons on this first side of the block, it's easy to just slide the rod over and it'll avoid hitting the throw of the crankshaft as you hammer the pistons in. For the pistons on the other side, it's going to be a little bit closer quarters, but we'll deal with that in a second when we get to the other side of the block. You'll start to get a feel for how much pressure you'll need to hit with to get the rings to slide out of the compressor and past the block deck. With each piston that goes in, you'll feel the rotation of the crank getting a bit harder to turn. The increase in resistance should feel pretty steady as each piston gets added.
When the first side of your block has all of its pistons in and rotating smoothly, you can rotate the block to the other side. If you haven't already, you need to dust out the cylinders and lube up the walls with an even coat of oil. Before the pistons go in on this side, remember that the ring gap positions are different. It isn't a big difference, they're basically just upside down compared to the gap patterns of the first side that you just did.
As the pistons go in on this side of the engine, there's a lot less room for them to clear the crank throw and the rod of the other piston that was installed on the other side. As soon as the rings clear the deck, and you can move the compressor out of the way, make sure that you pay close attention to keep the rod that's being installed from hitting either the crank or the rod from the other side of the block. As soon as the rod is just past the edge of the crank throw, then you can press it against the crank throw and then push the other rod over to make room for the one that's being installed to slip into place. Again, when it's time to put on the cap, make sure that the marks on the cap and the rod are on the same side as each other. As you do your check rotations, always rotate in the direction that the engine will be operating once it starts up. Continue cleaning and relubing the bearings as you go. As the last few pistons go in, it's going to start to get tough to rotate the crank by hand. It should be possible to rotate the crank with one hand though, even if your engine has a rope seal that pinches real tight on the rear of the crank. Once the pistons are in, it'll be time to rotate the block upside down, but before you do that,